Insurance professionals work hard every day to keep people safe. But as technology transforms the industry, how can insurers protect not only their clients, but also shield themselves from ever-changing cyber risks? My name's Elizabeth Blosfield, and I'm the host of the Insuring Cyber Podcast, a bi-monthly look into how the world of cyber and the business of insurance are connected. Have you ever thought about the difference between known unknowns and unknown unknowns? Okay, maybe that sounds like a riddle or a bit of a tongue twister, but it actually comes from Donald Rumsfeld, a former American politician who served as Secretary of Defense under President Gerald Ford and again under President George W. Bush. One of his most famous statements while serving as George W. Bush's Secretary of Defense addressed just that, known unknowns versus unknown unknowns. This quote was referenced by my guest for this podcast episode as insurers are seeking to grasp the use of AI chatbots such as ChatGPT. Tim Johnson, partner at law firm Browne Jacobson, spoke with me about how there are things insurers know they aren't experts at with AI but can learn along the way. These are the known unknowns. And then there are elements of AI that insurers haven't even conceptualized yet. In other words, unknown unknowns. Okay, I know I'm a writer who works with words every day, but all of these words are making my head spin. But I wanted to talk to Tim because he has a ton of knowledge in this area. He leads the firm's commercial services practice for insurance clients. He works with a number of insurers and intermediaries on policy drafting and distribution, compliance, and commercial issues. He recently wrote an article on Browne Jacobson's website about whether AI chatbots are helping or hindering insurers. In the article, he discussed whether ChatGPT could actually help insurers draft policy wordings. If you remember in our last podcast episode, I spoke with Will Bennett, a partner at Sachs, Dornberger, and Vita, about how insurers are using AI chatbots. If you missed it, you can check out the episode called How Much Should Insurers Trust AI Chatbots, anywhere you get your podcasts. Will and I touched on this conversation, and I promised we would have more for you this week. I think it's a fascinating question about whether insurers can use AI chatbots to draft policy wordings and achieve clearer policy language, among other things. So did Tim. So much so that he and his team actually did a preliminary experiment where they asked ChatGPT to draft a high net worth household insurance policy within certain parameters. Tim said at first blush, the document did look and feel like an insurance policy, with clearly identifiable insuring clauses and exclusions. But he said there were a number of problems that would impact its legal effectiveness. We talked about this and so much more during our conversation. Check it out. Hey, Tim, it's great to be speaking with you today. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well. Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I know we're going to dive into ChatGPT and generative AI in a few minutes, but I was wondering if you could start off just sort of talking about your background and some of the focus of your practice.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Tim Johnson. I'm a partner at Browne Jacobson, which is a law firm in the UK specialising in insurance law. My personal area of practice and specialism is in insurance policy drafting and distribution. So I advise insurers and other insurance intermediaries on their policy wordings, but also all of the rules and regulations around distributing those products in the UK in accordance with all applicable laws and regulations. So over the past sort of few years, we've been increasingly dealing with insurers who are using new technologies to distribute their products and to create their products. And so I've had a real interest in the use of technology in the creation of those products and their distribution.
Awesome. That's great. Yeah, that's great background. And that fits in really well with the conversation today. So I'm looking forward to it. I know there's been a rise in popularity of generative AI models like ChatGPT. What factors sort of led to this rise in popularity, especially within the insurance industry?
I think for me, there are sort of four key sort of main benefits. The first one is the speed at which it can attain information. Ultimately, insurers want as much information about a particular risk as they can possibly get, and ChatGPT and other AI models are able to gather that information faster than any human could using conventional research techniques. Equally, these models have access to sources that others may not normally have access to, or certainly by having access to the entire content of the web. Essentially, they are able to reach into places that a regular underwriter may not necessarily look to. So it's a speed of information, it's the availability of information in terms of the breadth of the information, but then it's the bits it can do on top of that in terms of analysing the information. So it can, to a certain extent, do the thinking. which is, I think, the bit that's really exciting underwriters. And that seems to be where all of the news is at the moment. Even over the last 6 months, we've seen huge steps forward in terms of AI's ability to actually think rather than just gather information. And the final bit, which I suppose is the generative bit, is how it's able to then present that information in different ways, and actually in a way that the user can, in some cases, choose. So they can ask ChatGPT, or they can ask the AI model how they want the information presented to them.
Right. Yeah, that's so interesting. It's crazy to think about AI being able to think for itself, but it does sound like there are a ton of benefits for underwriters. And I know you wrote in an article recently that ChatGPT's strength is that it draws information from the entire web, but you also wrote about how that can be a weakness because it can hinder its ability to distinguish accurate versus false information. So is that leading to any hesitancy among underwriters to embrace the technology, or, what other factors might be making underwriters more hesitant right now?
It certainly is, and I think hesitancy is a good thing for a number of reasons. And this is, for me, where it gets really interesting to look at these technologies and how they can help, because clearly there's huge potential. We've discussed those potential benefits. However, there are huge concerns over the accuracy of information. And in fact, this morning I was reading an article about two separate legal cases, in which one in the US, one in the UK, in which the legal submissions on behalf of the parties had been written with the assistance of ChatGPT and included citations from other cases that didn't exist, because ChatGPT, including quotes from judgments, that didn't exist, and these had been submitted to courts as part of legal cases, and there were serious sanctions. In one case, in the case in the UK, they got away with it because the individual didn't have a lawyer, so the court sort of gave them some leniency. But in the US case, there were some serious sanctions for the lawyer who'd been using ChatGPT to generate these legal arguments, but hadn't then taken the step of checking ChatGPT's content, which resulted in incorrect submissions going to court. And that's exactly the issue we're talking about here, albeit in a completely different professional field. We're talking about the information not being accurate and the AI tools not being clever enough at this stage to distinguish between news and fake news, if you like. And that those cases perfectly demonstrate that the issues of using AI and then slavishly relying on it and doing no secondary checking yourself to actually check the source it's used and to check they're accurate. And for me, this lack of accuracy, or the potential lack of accuracy, means that we just don't know where we are with AI tools at the moment. And I always think about the Donald Rumsfeld quote about known unknowns and unknown unknowns. And for me, insurers are ultimately, they're in the risk business, so they know that things might happen that they don't know about, which will cause them to pay out a claim. That's kind of the whole point of insurance, of course. But what insurers do at the moment is obviously they understand the particular risk, they gather as much information as possible, and they know the sector in which that risk operates. And so whilst they know some things might happen that could result in a claim coming, and they are largely outside their control, ultimately they are known risks, and underwriters go into those policies, they write those risks with their eyes open, because they've got years of actuarial data for that particular sector and those kind of risks. However, by throwing AI into the mix, at the moment, we just don't really know how accurate AI is. And so for an underwriter, it's essentially adding an unknown into the mix, in that what additional risk is posed by the use of AI in the information gathering stage or in the underwriting process. And I'm not aware there is any real reliable evidence yet as to the accuracy or otherwise. And the way I stress test it in my head is, how would an actuary working at an insurer, how would they price a risk that's used AI to undertake some of the underwriting, or even gather some of the risk information, knowing that some of that information might be incorrect? And I'm not sure how they would do it at the moment. And so for me, although it's sort of slightly perversely, insurers are in the risk business, the one thing they are generally not prepared to do is take additional risk, particularly a risk that they are unable to quantify and don't really know enough about. In fact, insurers will pay a premium to avoid that sort of thing. And so I think that's where we are with AI at the moment. Whilst clearly there's huge potential, underwriters are naturally hesitant, to go back to your question, because we just don't know what we don't know yet in terms of the potential impact and inaccuracy of AI. So that's why I think there is hesitancy, and for those reasons I think it's sensible for insurers and underwriters to be cautious and hesitant about placing too much reliance on AI.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And that sort of leads into my next question as well, because I know I keep hearing talk about how the insurance industry is sort of behind other industries in embracing AI technology, and that, if they don't adapt to these tools, they'll fall behind. I was curious what your thoughts are on that, because I know, as you mentioned, it's still so early and it is such an unknown risk, whether it warrants a little bit more caution.
I think it does. I think in terms of the statement, are insurers behind other industries in adopting AI tools? I think that probably is the case. But I don't think it's a bad thing necessarily. And what I often hear people say is that insurers are generally not innovative and that they are behind the times. And sort of before looking at AI, I just wanted to address that. I don't think that's necessarily the case. If we think about the innovations we've seen in recent years, we've seen the use of telematics, we've seen parametric contracts, including some really innovative contracts in New York for the New York City flood scheme, and we've got parametric contracts in New Zealand that pay out within days of an earthquake event based purely on seismology reasons. We have health insurance products that track health data using smartwatches and incentivize customers to make positive risk decisions, i.e. taking exercise, through those devices and through apps. We have products being distributed through apps with flexible pricing. We've had the use of big data in insurance for years. So generally insurers are innovative in my view in terms of both the design and the distribution of their products. However, all of those examples I've just given are areas where that innovation effectively gives insurers additional certainty, gives them more information, or it gives them some objective measures upon which they can assess a risk, whether it's to do with health data or how an individual is driving a vehicle. It gives them that additional information. However, where we are at the moment with AI is different, I think. AI at the moment, rather than adding clarity, it can add to uncertainty for the reasons I've discussed, and that we just don't know how accurate it is yet. And so that's why, notwithstanding the sort of the push forward to be as innovative as possible, that's why, in my mind, insurers aren't using AI as much as other sectors. So there's that sort of very sensible risk reason which we've sort of already looked at. But I think also we have to bear in mind that insurance is an extremely heavily regulated industry, and any material change to a business processing system or the business operations of an insurance company have to be extremely thoroughly and robustly tested before you can just wheel them out. I mean, imagine a worst case scenario of some AI makes a mistake and it incorrectly identifies the flood risk for a large number of commercial properties in a certain location, and then there is a flood and it had incorrectly analysed that risk or incorrectly pulled through that information. That ultimately leads to a liquidity risk or a prudential risk for that insurer, because it can end up picking tens of millions of pounds or dollars worth of claims which the insurer didn't really have within its risk appetite, hadn't properly priced and hadn't assessed the risk for, because of a mistake in AI. And running those sorts of risks would certainly not be acceptable to the regulator, certainly wouldn't be acceptable to the regulator in the UK. And so even if an insurer did just want to say, let's use AI, it has to be very, very robustly tested, and they would have to go through all the actuarial calculations. They'd have to understand the risk. They'd have to have risk mitigation procedures in place to make sure that they don't ultimately present a liquidity risk for that insurer. There's also practical considerations as to why it's just not that simple to rule it out. So most AI at the moment, or lots of AI, certainly the most advanced AI, is open source. So what happens if that open source provider changes how it works or withdraws it? Simply decides they're going to take it offline. There's no one to sue if it goes wrong. You haven't got a contractual agreement in place with the AI provider that compels them to continue to provide it. There are no minimum service levels. So how can you build that into your underwriting or product distribution systems when you've got no sort of solid contractual background, you've got no business continuity planning to ensure that continues? And so from an operational resilience perspective, I can't see at this point how an insurer could easily materially build AI into what they're doing unless they actually either develop their own or actually engaged a software company to develop something for them where there were solid and robust contractual mechanisms in place with service levels and consequences for and backup plans in the event of that service not being able to be delivered. And I think we're not there yet, and that model would obviously be eye-wateringly expensive, which would be prohibitive in many cases for a number of insurers. So the sort of whole discussion about AI, particularly insofar as it's relating to open source AI such as ChatGPT, based on how it currently exists, it's difficult to see how that could be built into the mechanics of a product distribution system and underwriting mechanism, because those processes and procedures just simply aren't robust enough, and there's no business continuity, and there's no operational resilience that enables underwriters to be absolutely certain that they will get the continued level of service and that will be and that will be suitably robust.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it sounds like it all sort of comes back to insurers having that certainty. That's an interesting point that you mentioned about other technologies like telematics, for example, that are introducing more certainty for insurers. But with AI, it's such an unknown at this point. And that kind of leads into my next question too, because I was curious if you expect underwriting to change at all as a result of insureds' use of AI. So, I've heard some conversation about whether exclusions in insurance policies might be likely regarding AI, or if underwriters might begin exercising a little more scrutiny for businesses that use those tools.
Yeah, I do, particularly for professional services businesses. So for professional indemnity and professional liability policies, I think underwriters will want to start knowing, and I think they'll want to start asking these questions pretty quickly. They will want to start knowing how professional advice is generated and whether or not professionals across any discipline really are using AI to generate their advice. I mean, I gave two examples earlier about the legal cases where in one case, a law firm was using ChatGPT to create legal submissions, and that had led to a mistake. Now, if I was an underwriter, I would certainly want to know if the lawyers or any other professional I am insuring are using ChatGPT or any other AI for the provision of their professional business. And I'd want to know a bit more about what they're doing. So we hear a lot about AI without really drilling into what it means. There are really basic models of AI which aren't really AI, but people call it AI. So there are lots of contract review tools that lawyers use, which essentially read contracts very quickly and identify if certain boilerplate clauses are in there. That's not really AI. It's sort of an advanced search function, really. That's one thing. But in that situation, the AI, such as it is, isn't actually undertaking the professional activity. It's not doing the professional thinking or the advising. It's essentially an information gathering tool. That's one end of the spectrum that underwriters may fairly soon get fairly comfortable with. Take the other end of the spectrum, the cases I've mentioned where it's actually delivering the professional product. You would want to know if that's happening. You would also, as an underwriter, I think, want to know the extent to which a professional is double checking that information. Or are they actually relying solely on the AI to get that right? So I think these are sorts of questions that underwriters are wanting to know about. And I think just sort of knowing how policy wordings evolve when new risks come about, I think initially we'll see some reticence and some caution, which will likely, in my view, lead to just blanket exclusions for claims arising from the use of AI. But then I think as underwriters get a bit more comfortable with it, and as they start to understand how AI is used in its different forms, I think we'll then start to see some slightly more sophisticated policy conditions around its usage, because I don't think it will be an option realistically for the entire insurance market to simply refuse ad infinitum to cover claims arising from AI, because it's coming, and professional services firms in particular will be starting to use AI more and more. And so it will simply become probably uncommercial for insurers to simply just blanket exclude it. So they're going to have to get comfortable with it, or at least get comfortable with the aspects of it they're happy with and which they're not, and what questions they need to be asking and what conditions they need to be putting around it. But I think we'll start off with blanket exclusions, but I think it will evolve from there.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There's definitely a lot to think about. It'll be interesting to see how it evolves. And
Yeah.
speaking of, policy changes, I know one of your areas of focus is policy wordings, and you mentioned in your article that ChatGPT can produce large and complex documents pretty quickly, which has led to some questions about whether it can assist with producing documents like insurance policy wordings and contracts. What are the likelihood, or what is the likelihood of this becoming, more common in the future?
Yeah, so we did it just as a bit of fun, really, because when it was more fun than you think. We wanted to just sort of say, well, like, yeah, how good is it? Because you read about so much about AI, ChatGPT. Thought, well, can it actually draft a contract? So we gave it some parameters and asked it to produce a contract, and it produced a decent sort of first draft. And that's where I could see it being quite useful in that literally within seconds, it can produce a first draft document of several pages, which is a decent base upon which a professional can then complete the job. What AI isn't great at yet, and who knows whether it will be in future, is applying the law. So it can find and summarize the law if you ask it to. It can even apply it to facts, although evidently there's issues with that from the case I've mentioned. But to actually create a legal binding contract that then complies with very specific laws is where it seems to struggle. And on our test, that's where it didn't really work. So I think we're way off there, and we'll see if the algorithms improve. But I think where we are at the moment is it can create first drafts which are, if someone who knows what they're doing, is then given access to that draft, they can fix it. And I think that's sort of where we are in terms of document generation at the moment.
Right. Yeah. And I love this. I love that you did this experiment. So you basically asked ChatGPT to draft a high net worth household insurance policy within certain parameters. Is that right?
Yes, we did. And it is pretty good, actually. So, well, I say that. It produced what looked and felt like a clearly recognizable legal contract. It clearly set out sections for definitions, insuring clauses, exclusions, conditions, settlement terms. So if you sort of looked at it, it sort of looked and felt like a decentish legal contract. So in that sense, and that's what I mean about creating a first draft, which is actually a decent first go that you can then do something with. However, the style was very archaic, and we've seen on both sides of the Atlantic, we've seen a real push towards more readable policy wordings, driven by the regulator, but also driven by commercial demands. The language of ChatGPT's policy was quite old-fashioned and out of date, such that I don't think any commercial insurer these days would want to use it. And what's also interesting is we didn't give it really detailed instructions as to precisely what exclusions we wanted in this policy. For example, we said, we wanted a market standard policy, and it included some of the standard exclusions I would expect to see, but it didn't include a lot of the others. So insofar as it was making decisions as to the scope of cover, it was some way off the mark. And so for me, what that really does, it really reinforces the point that if anyone is using ChatGPT in insurance or otherwise, it's really important to really check its output, because in this case, it didn't include a lot of the standard content we would expect to see. And I made the point before about it not necessarily applying legal principles quite correctly. There was a principle in the UK, there's a law called the Insurance Act, and in very brief, there is a condition of the Insurance Act which states that if you have a condition in a policy which is designed to reduce the risk of a particular type of loss occurring, or a risk occurring at a particular time and place. So, for example, setting a fire alarm when a property is unattended is designed to reduce the risk of fire, obviously. What Section 11 of the Insurance Act says is that if you have a condition that you set a fire alarm, if the policyholder doesn't set the fire alarm, what it means is the policy doesn't respond whilst the fire alarm isn't set. But even if there isn't a fire, even if there is a loss during that period, cover is still engaged if the policyholder can show that the breach couldn't have increased the risk of the loss occurring. So it's quite a complex point, but it's effectively a policyholder protection that was brought in a few years ago. ChatGPT completely missed that and just added outright exclusions for those type of conditions, which were not allowed and not permitted in the UK. And we did ask it to draft it in accordance with English law. So there were some areas where it didn't quite apply the law correctly, and equally it didn't apply some of the things slightly different from what you'd expect from the insurance contract. So this drafted it with 2 signature blocks at the bottom to be signed on behalf of the insurer and signed on behalf of the policyholder, which obviously isn't normally how insurance contracts are distributed. It drafted it more like a conventional contract between 2 parties. So as I said, but there were some issues with it, and it needs someone with a bit of experience and some legal knowledge or insurance knowledge to fix it. But as I say, the first draft was, for something it produced in 10 seconds, it was a decent first start, is how I would describe it if my trainee solicitor produced it.
Yeah, it sounds like an interesting experiment and definitely some important lessons and takeaways. If you're using ChatGPT, definitely fact check for now. But
Yes.
It's great for insurers to be aware of that capability. And so thanks for sharing that with us. And, my last question, just given everything that we've talked about, what should insurers be thinking about right now as models like ChatGPT are becoming more common, or, how can they be preparing for more insureds to be implementing that into their business strategies?
I think more than ever, it's really important for underwriters to know the markets in which they're operating. And that's always been the case, hasn't it? Underwriters, you need to understand the sectors in which their policyholders operate. It's so important for them now to understand how their policyholders are using tech. So we spoke about professional businesses, for example, and how they use AI. It goes to any other sector. So I would say to underwriters, just keep talking to policyholders, keep consuming as much information as you can about how the particular sector in which you operate is developing and how it's using AI, because different sectors will use it differently and the risks will present differently. So just keep consuming that information, keep staying on top of it, and really sort of stress testing it. So thinking about how it could impact a loss. So we've mentioned professional lines and how it could impact that. And then really as an underwriter think, well, what is the appetite to insure this? How brave does the underwriter want to be in terms of, maybe offering some cover? And I think the more underwriters get comfortable with the tech and comfortable with how it's used, ultimately, as with any underwriting, it enables them to make, better decisions about what risks they're able to accept, or in a sense, the known unknowns, as I mentioned earlier, and which ones it's simply not prepared to. So I suppose my final note would be to continue to exercise caution for all of the reasons we've discussed. I don't think just ploughing forward and applying AI to everything is the way. I think we're a long way off that. But equally, just keep as close to developments as possible, because it's inevitable that it's on the way and we're going to see more of it.
Yeah, that's all great advice for underwriters. And I love that point about the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. That's a great point as well. And this has been a fascinating conversation. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak.
My pleasure.
Well, that's it for this episode. Thanks so much to Tim for taking the time to speak with me, and thanks to all of you for listening. Once again, my name's Elizabeth Blosfield, and I'm the host of the Insuring Cyber Podcast, a bi-monthly look into how the world of cyber and the business of insurance are connected. Be sure to check back for new episodes of this podcast, publishing every other Wednesday wherever you get your podcasts. Talk to you next time.